It was a quiet afternoon in the small town of Fairview, tucked between hills and surrounded by forests that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden glow over the streets and homes. Children played outside, their laughter echoing in the warm spring air. It was a place where everyone knew each other, where the rhythm of life felt slow and steady, unhurried by the chaos of the outside world. Charlie Matthews, a lanky 12-year-old with messy brown hair and bright blue eyes, had always loved the peace of Fairview. He spent most afternoons running through the woods behind his house, imagining himself as a fearless explorer or a secret agent on a mission. The dense trees, the rustling leaves, the sounds of birds and animals, everything in nature felt familiar, safe, and comforting to him. But that afternoon, everything changed. Charlie had just finished his homework, which, in his mind, was a monumental victory for a boy who'd rather be outside than sitting at a desk. With the sun still high in the sky, he stepped out onto the back porch, stretching his legs and breathing in the fresh air. His sister, Ella, was out in the yard, her laughter filling the space as she ran around chasing butterflies. She was only 5, small and full of energy, with blonde curls bouncing around her face. Charlie loved his little sister more than anything. She was his partner in crime, always willing to play make-believe or go on wild adventures. He often found himself watching over her, keeping an eye on her as she darted around, her bright giggles infectious. But just as he was about to call out to Ella to join him in one of his makeshift adventures, something changed. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, a shift in the atmosphere. The air, which had been warm and pleasant, suddenly felt heavy. The distant sounds of birds seemed to quiet, and the usual rustling of the trees was replaced with an eerie stillness. Then he heard it. A scream. It cut through the air like a knife, shrill and desperate. The kind of scream that sent a chill straight to your spine, the kind that didn't belong in a place like Fairview. A scream that meant someone was in danger. Charlie's heart skipped a beat. He turned toward the woods, the direction from which the scream had come. It was a familiar part of the woods, the same stretch of trees where he and Ella had spent countless hours playing, their feet crunching on the dried leaves, their imaginations running wild. But now, that place seemed different. Darker. More foreboding. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. His instincts screamed at him to go inside, to run and hide with Ella, to ignore whatever he had just heard and pretend nothing was wrong. But he couldn't. He couldn't just pretend that scream hadn't happened. It had been too real. Too urgent. Before he could think it through any further, another sound reached his ears, footsteps. Rapid and uneven, crunching on the forest floor. Someone was running, or rather, stumbling through the woods. A woman's voice called out, ragged and full of fear. Help! Somebody, please! Charlie's stomach twisted. His heart was pounding in his chest, louder than the screams. His breath hitched in his throat as he froze, trying to make sense of what he was hearing. His mind raced, trying to place the voice. Who was it? Why was someone out there, in the woods, alone? He looked back toward Ella, who was still playing in the yard, blissfully unaware of the chaos unfolding just beyond the tree line. Charlie wanted to run to her, to grab her hand and pull her inside. But something held him in place, something deeper, something that told him he couldn't just walk away. There was something in those cries, a desperation that he couldn't ignore. Another scream rang out, louder this time, echoing through the trees. It was then that Charlie realized the screams were coming from deeper in the woods, much farther than he had expected. Whoever it was, they were far away from the safety of the neighborhood, too far for anyone to hear them. It was a terrifying thought, no one would hear them. No one could help. Charlie didn't waste another second. His legs moved before he could even think, carrying him across the yard and toward the woods. He knew he wasn't supposed to go into the woods alone, especially at dusk when the shadows grew long and the night creatures started to stir. But this was different. This was real. Someone needed help, and Charlie wasn't the type of person to stand by and do nothing. He pushed through the thick underbrush, the branches scratching at his skin as he tried to stay low, out of sight. The woods were dense, but he knew them like the back of his hand. He had spent countless hours there, exploring every nook and cranny, learning every twisted tree and secret path. But tonight, even the woods felt unfamiliar. The air seemed colder, and the trees cast long, menacing shadows that made Charlie's skin crawl. As he pushed forward, the cries grew louder. He could hear the desperation in them, the fear that no child should ever feel. His heart raced with every step. What was happening out there? Who was making those sounds? And why was no one else around to help? The woods stretched out before him, endless and dark. Charlie's breath came in short, ragged bursts, his footsteps echoing through the stillness. He tried to steady himself, forcing his mind to focus. He couldn't panic. He couldn't let fear take over. He had to think. He had to be smart. Then, suddenly, he stopped. In front of him, through the thick trees, he saw a figure. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, dragging something behind him. His steps were hurried, and he was muttering to himself, his voice low and strained. Charlie's heart skipped a beat as he realized who, the man was dragging. It was a child. Charlie's breath caught in his throat. His mind screamed for him to turn around, to run and tell someone, to get help. But his legs wouldn't move. His body was frozen, unable to tear its eyes away from the horrifying scene before him. The man was pulling a little girl through the woods, her tiny body limp, her legs dragging behind her. Charlie's eyes widened as he recognized her, Sarah, the 6-year-old girl who lived down the street. He had seen her playing with her mother just a few hours ago, laughing as they tended to their garden. Sarah was crying. Her sobs were loud and heart-wrenching, but the man didn't seem to care. He didn't slow his pace. He didn't acknowledge her cries. He just kept dragging her through the woods, deeper into the darkness. Charlie's heart pounded in his chest as he realized the danger. The girl wasn't just lost. She was being taken. Kidnapped. He had to act. There was no time to waste. But what could he do? He was just a kid. What good was he against a man so much bigger and stronger than he was? His fingers trembled as he gripped a branch, holding it tightly as if the strength of the tree could somehow transfer to him. His mind raced as he tried to think of a plan, tried to figure out how he could stop this, how he could save Sarah. But in that moment, all he could think about was getting closer, getting to her before it was too late. He crept forward, taking slow, careful steps. His eyes never left the man or the girl. Every muscle in his body was on alert, ready to spring into action at a moment's notice. The man was getting farther away, but Charlie didn't dare shout or make any noise that might alert him. He had to be silent. He had to move quickly. Just then, the man turned, his head snapping toward the direction Charlie had been hiding. For a split second, their eyes locked. Charlie's heart skipped a beat, and time seemed to freeze. The man's eyes were dark, cold, and filled with something Charlie couldn't quite understand. Hatred? Anger? Something dangerous. Then, the man jerked Sarah roughly by the arm, making her stumble and cry out. The sound pierced Charlie's heart, a desperate plea for help that echoed through his bones. Charlie's body froze, his feet planted to the ground. The man's gaze lingered for a moment, then moved away as he continued dragging Sarah deeper into the woods. Charlie's mind raced. This was it. He had to do something. Charlie's heart thundered in his chest, the sound deafening in his ears. His legs felt like they were made of lead as they refused to move. He wanted to run, wanted to escape, to find safety, to get help, but the sight of Sarah, the little girl he'd known for years, being dragged through the woods against her will, held him in place. His stomach churned with a mix of fear, guilt, and something else, something deep and primal that pushed him forward, despite every instinct that told him to turn back. His breath came in short bursts, each exhale shaky and uneven. He tried to steady himself, to think clearly, but his mind was racing too fast. The man who had taken Sarah was so much bigger than he was, and from the looks of it, much stronger. Charlie's mind kept looping back to one horrifying question: what if I fail? The man had seen him. Their eyes had locked for a moment, and Charlie felt an icy shiver run down his spine. He had been caught, and yet, the man hadn't chased him. For now, it seemed like he had been distracted enough by Sarah's cries that he hadn't thought twice about the small shadow in the bushes. The thought that the man might return to look for him sent a jolt of fear through his entire body. But no. Charlie couldn't waste time thinking about the what-ifs. Sarah needed him. Now. He quickly crouched low, making his way closer, his feet barely making a sound on the soft forest floor. The branches and twigs beneath him seemed to protest with every movement, but Charlie wasn't about to let anything stop him. He had to keep going. He had to find a way to save her. The deeper into the woods they went, the darker it became. The trees, tall and imposing, cast long shadows over the path, creating a labyrinth of darkness that made it almost impossible to see. Charlie's eyes darted back and forth, scanning for any sign of movement, his breath shallow as he tried to stay as quiet as possible. He pushed through the dense underbrush, careful not to make a sound. The air felt thick with tension, and Charlie's mind raced with every possible plan. What could he do? What should he do? Should he scream for help? Should he try to grab a branch and confront the man? What if the man had a weapon? What if? No more what-ifs. He had to focus. Charlie squinted ahead, trying to catch another glimpse of the man and Sarah. There they were, not too far ahead. The man had slowed, his back to Charlie as he dragged Sarah along. She wasn't crying as loudly now, but her small, sobbing breaths were audible in the still air. "Please, stop," Sarah whispered weakly. Her voice trembled, almost inaudible in the forest's heavy silence. "I want to go home." Hearing her voice sent a cold pang through Charlie's chest. It was clear that she was scared, helpless, alone. And it was his fault. He should have been there. He should have done something sooner. Why did I wait so long? But there was no time to dwell on that now. Charlie had to think quickly. He glanced around, looking for anything he could use as a weapon, anything to help him get closer to Sarah. His gaze fell on a large branch lying on the ground, half covered by leaves. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. He crept toward it, his fingers brushing the rough bark. He picked it up cautiously, testing its weight. It felt sturdy enough. It wasn't a sword or a gun, but it could be useful. If he had to, he could at least use it to defend himself, or to distract the man long enough to free Sarah. He gripped the branch tightly, holding it like a makeshift club, and took another step forward. But as he did, the forest seemed to grow louder. A twig snapped beneath his foot. Charlie froze. He held his breath, praying the man hadn't heard. His heart was pounding in his chest, so loud that it seemed to echo through the trees. He waited for what felt like an eternity, his muscles tense and ready to spring into action. Finally, the man shifted, but not in the direction Charlie had expected. The man was still focused on Sarah, barely glancing back as he continued dragging her deeper into the woods. Charlie let out a silent sigh of relief. This was his chance. He moved quickly now, staying low to the ground, his breath coming in quiet, controlled bursts. He had to get closer, just a little bit closer. He couldn't afford to mess this up. The closer he got, the better his chances of stopping the man before it was too late. As Charlie advanced, the forest grew darker. The tall trees formed an almost impenetrable canopy overhead, blocking out the last bits of daylight. He could barely make out the silhouettes of the man and Sarah ahead, their figures flickering in and out of view as they moved deeper into the shadows. Charlie's mind raced. What could he do? Should he yell out? Should he charge at the man with the branch? His hands were trembling now, his grip tightening on the stick. He was close. So close. Just a few more steps and he would be there, right behind the man. But what was his plan once he got there? He had no clear answer. There was no plan. No guarantee that anything would work. His only certainty was that he couldn't let Sarah be taken. Not when he had the chance to stop it. The man stopped abruptly, and Charlie froze. The silence in the woods was deafening. For a moment, Charlie thought the man had heard him, thought the worst had happened. But then he realized, no. The man wasn't listening for him. The man was listening to something else. From deeper within the woods, there was a sudden sound, low, guttural, like an animal growling. Then, something moving through the trees. Something heavy. The man turned sharply, his eyes wide with alarm. He cursed under his breath, muttering to himself in frustration. Charlie froze, holding his breath, but the man didn't seem to notice him. He glanced over his shoulder, as if waiting for something. Then, without warning, the man started dragging Sarah faster, his pace quickening, his grip tightening on her arm. Charlie's heart skipped a beat. What was happening? What was out there? He had no time to think. His feet moved before his mind could catch up. He dashed forward, staying low, using every ounce of strength to push his legs faster. He could hear the man's heavy footsteps ahead, and the sound of Sarah's weak cries filled the air, but now the cries were different, choked, muffled, as if she were trying to scream, but couldn't. Charlie's pulse pounded in his ears. He was close. So close now. The man's form loomed ahead, and Charlie raised the branch, his fingers tight around the rough wood. He was ready. He had no other choice but to act. But just as he took a step forward, the sound of a twig snapping under his foot echoed like thunder through the woods. The man's head whipped around. Their eyes met. For a moment, everything froze. Charlie's heart skipped a beat, his breath caught in his throat. The man's eyes were wide with shock, his face twisted into a mix of surprise and fury. Charlie's stomach dropped. He had been caught. "Who's there?" the man growled, his voice low and dangerous. Charlie's pulse raced, his body frozen in place. The branch in his hand suddenly felt heavy, useless. What had he done? What had he gotten himself into? But before he could think further, the man's gaze shifted, and for a split second, Charlie saw a flicker of something, fear. It was brief, but unmistakable. Then, the man turned and ran, dragging Sarah along with him into the deeper woods, disappearing into the shadows. The forest was alive with sound, a cacophony of rustling leaves, snapping twigs, and the rhythmic pounding of feet against the earth. Charlie's breath came in sharp, uneven bursts as he pushed himself harder, faster, but the man ahead of him was a shadow, a ghost that darted through the trees, dragging Sarah along like a rag doll. Charlie's heart raced in his chest, his thoughts scattered, disjointed. The adrenaline coursed through his veins, but with it came a suffocating weight of fear. Fear that he wouldn't catch up. Fear that it would be too late. Fear that Sarah, his neighbor, the sweet 6-year-old girl with the infectious laugh, was slipping away from him, disappearing into the woods forever. The man had seen him. That much was clear. Charlie had been caught. But what came next? Would the man stop? Would he turn and come after him? Would he let go of Sarah and make his escape? The answer came almost immediately. The man didn't stop. He didn't slow down. He didn't even look back as he continued to drag Sarah deeper into the forest. His movements were swift, almost animalistic, as if he were being driven by some unseen force. His grip on Sarah's arm was firm, unyielding. Her small frame was barely able to keep up, stumbling over roots and rocks as she was pulled along the uneven path. Charlie's chest tightened. He had no plan. No strategy. No backup. He was alone. He had no weapons. And yet, in that moment, there was something inside of him, something primal, that refused to let go of the idea of saving Sarah. He couldn't let fear paralyze him. He couldn't let the man win. Not when he still had a chance. He pushed himself harder, his legs burning with the effort, the air growing thin as he sprinted between the trees, keeping the man and Sarah in his sight. It was a frantic, chaotic chase. A chase that felt as though the very ground beneath him was shifting, pulling him deeper into a nightmare he couldn't escape. The woods, which had once felt so familiar, now seemed like a maze. Every path looked the same, every tree an identical sentinel, standing like a wall between him and the man who was slowly pulling Sarah farther away from safety. The forest closed in around him, dark and oppressive, suffocating him with its tangled branches and dense underbrush. "Hold on, Sarah," Charlie whispered to himself, his voice tight with panic. "I'm coming." It felt impossible. The gap between him and the man widened with every passing second, and Charlie's legs screamed for mercy. He could feel the burn in his calves, the sharp sting of exhaustion clawing at his muscles, but he couldn't stop. He couldn't give up. He was too close. Sarah was too close. Just when Charlie thought he might collapse, when the world around him seemed to blur and spin, a sudden, sharp sound pierced through the air. A scream. It wasn't Sarah's voice. It wasn't the man's. It was something else. Charlie's heart lurched in his chest. The scream was followed by a series of low, guttural growls, animalistic, terrifying sounds that seemed to reverberate through the trees. The noise was unnatural, like something out of a horror film. But this wasn't a movie. This was real. The man stopped abruptly, his head snapping around as the growls grew louder, closer. For a moment, it was as if time had stopped. Charlie froze mid-step, his foot hovering above the ground, the sound of his own breath loud in his ears. The man's body tensed, his grip on Sarah tightening as he looked over his shoulder, his eyes darting to and fro in a panic. Charlie held his breath, trying to stay hidden. His mind raced with possibilities. What was out there? What was making those sounds? Could it be a bear? Or something worse? But the man didn't waste any more time. With a guttural grunt, he started running again, dragging Sarah faster now, his movements frantic. The growling noise followed them, growing louder and more insistent. It wasn't just a sound anymore, it was a presence, something dark and hungry that was closing in on them. Charlie's instincts screamed at him to run, to get away from whatever it was that was chasing them, but he couldn't. He wouldn't. Not when Sarah needed him. Not when he was the only one who could help. He pushed forward, harder now, following the man's trail through the thick underbrush, his eyes darting left and right, searching for any sign of what was following them. And then, in an instant, it happened. The man stumbled. His foot caught on a hidden root, and he lurched forward, losing his grip on Sarah. She tumbled to the ground with a sharp cry, the sound of her body hitting the earth echoing through the trees. For a moment, everything froze. Charlie's heart stopped. The man scrambled to his feet, his eyes wide with panic as he glanced around, as if realizing for the first time that he had made a mistake. Sarah lay motionless on the ground, her small body curled into a ball, her face pale and her eyes squeezed shut. "Get up," the man hissed through clenched teeth. "Get up, now." But Sarah didn't move. Charlie's heart raced, his legs carrying him toward them before he even realized what he was doing. He was close now, so close he could reach her. His breath was coming in jagged gasps, his body aching from the exertion, but he didn't care. All that mattered was getting to Sarah. The man was still recovering from his fall, his focus on the girl at his feet. Charlie saw his chance. Without thinking, Charlie lunged forward, grabbing a fallen branch that lay nearby. He didn't hesitate. With all the strength he could muster, he swung the branch at the man's head, striking him across the side of his temple. The impact was jarring. The man grunted, a surprised gasp escaping his lips as he staggered back, his hand going to his head. The blow was enough to knock the man off balance, and he staggered backward, momentarily stunned. Charlie took a step back, ready to defend himself if the man came at him. But the man wasn't finished yet. He recovered quickly, his eyes blazing with fury. "You little brat," the man growled, his voice thick with venom. "You're going to regret that." But Charlie wasn't afraid anymore. He wasn't thinking about his own safety. He wasn't thinking about anything other than the girl lying on the ground, her fragile body crumpled and defenseless. "Leave her alone," Charlie shouted, raising the branch again, ready to strike if he had to. The man's lips curled into a snarl, and for a moment, it seemed like he might charge at Charlie. But then, the growling noises came again, louder now, closer. The man's head whipped around, his eyes wide with fear. And then it happened. From the shadows of the trees, something emerged. Something massive, its eyes glowing in the dark. It was a bear. A huge, black bear, its fur matted and wild, its teeth bared in a primal snarl. The growls were no longer a mystery. The bear was right there, and it was hungry. For a moment, the man froze, his eyes locked on the bear in terror. The bear, however, seemed unfazed by his presence. It sniffed the air, its focus shifting from the man to Sarah, who was still lying on the ground, barely moving. Charlie's mind went into overdrive. There was no way he could fight a bear. He wasn't prepared for this. But Sarah needed him. He didn't know what came over him, but he made a snap decision. Without thinking, he grabbed Sarah's wrist and yanked her up from the ground. She didn't fight him. She didn't even react. She was limp in his arms, too weak to move on her own. "Come on, Sarah," Charlie whispered desperately, pulling her toward the trees. "Come on, we need to go." But the bear was moving closer, its massive paws thudding on the ground, its eyes locked on Sarah. Charlie's pulse raced, his mind a blur of fear and desperation. He couldn't let the bear get to her. He had to get away. He had to save her. Charlie's heart pounded like a drum in his chest. His limbs felt like they were moving in slow motion, the weight of Sarah in his arms dragging him down as the enormous bear lumbered toward them, its glowing eyes fixed on Sarah with a terrifying intensity. The world seemed to narrow to a single point, the bear's hunger, its massive form growing closer with each passing second. There was no time. Charlie knew he couldn't outrun it. He couldn't fight it. All he had was his wits, and a desperate need to protect Sarah, who was limp in his arms, too scared and weak to help herself. He glanced over his shoulder, seeing the bear closing in, its breath heavy and deep. The bear's nostrils flared as it sniffed the air, its sharp gaze never leaving Sarah, whose frail body trembled against Charlie's chest. It was as though the bear could smell her fear, and it was drawn to it. The man, still recovering from the blow Charlie had struck him earlier, stood frozen in shock. He had turned, watching the bear's approach with wide eyes, clearly realizing that he was no longer the biggest threat in the woods. But that realization didn't bring him any closer to saving himself or Sarah. In fact, it seemed to paralyze him. Charlie didn't have the luxury of hesitation. There was no room for fear or second thoughts. He had to act now, or everything would be lost. His mind raced, trying to calculate his next move, but the bear wasn't waiting for him to come up with a plan. It was already upon them, its massive frame blocking the path ahead. Its claws scraping against the ground with each slow step it took. "Move!" Charlie shouted, the words barely more than a hoarse whisper, his voice tight with panic. But Sarah didn't respond. She couldn't. Her body was almost completely unresponsive, and Charlie could feel the weight of her head against his shoulder, her breathing shallow and erratic. I have to get her to safety. I have to get away. He scanned the area around them, looking for a way out, but the trees were thick and unyielding, the underbrush so dense that even if they ran, they would be trapped. The bear was too close. Too fast. There was no escape. Except. A flash of movement caught Charlie's eye. A narrow gap between two trees, barely wide enough for him to squeeze through. It wasn't much, but it was a chance that he had to take. He wasn't about to let Sarah be devoured by the bear. Not when they were so close to freedom. Come on, Sarah, he whispered, his voice frantic as he adjusted his grip on her. He forced himself to take a deep breath, steadying himself as he focused on the narrow opening between the trees. We're almost there. The bear, sensing their movement, gave a low, menacing growl. Its fur bristled as it advanced, the distance between them shrinking with every passing second. It was too close. The bear's teeth gleamed in the dim light, sharp and yellow, ready to tear through flesh. Charlie could feel his heart slam in his chest. Every instinct told him to run, but the ground was uneven, the woods dark, and Sarah in his arms was a liability. Please, he whispered, his breath catching. He wasn't sure if he was speaking to Sarah or to the universe itself. Please, don't let this be the end. He ducked into the gap between the trees, squeezing through the opening with Sarah still in his arms, the brush tearing at his clothes and skin as he pushed through. He didn't dare look back. He couldn't afford to. Not now. The bear was close. Too close. Suddenly, he heard it, an animalistic roar, a chilling sound that reverberated through the trees and struck fear deep into his bones. The bear was angry now, desperate. It wasn't going to give up. Charlie's pulse raced as he pushed through the underbrush, trying to find some kind of shelter, anything that could give them a fighting chance. He glanced at Sarah. Her face was pale, her eyes barely open. She was barely conscious, and the fear that had gripped her earlier had now given way to a strange stillness. She was fading. He gritted his teeth. Not now. Not when she's this close. His legs were screaming in pain, his arms trembling with the strain of carrying her, but he couldn't stop. There was no time. The bear was still behind them, the thud of its paws growing louder as it closed in, its hunger driving it forward with relentless force. Charlie's mind raced. He needed something, anything, to stop the bear. His eyes scanned the ground, searching for a weapon. A stick. A rock. Something to defend themselves. And then, his eyes fell on it. A thick, sturdy branch, lying on the ground nearby. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. Without thinking, Charlie dropped Sarah to the ground, just for a moment, and grabbed the branch. It was heavy in his hands, but it felt solid, a small comfort in the face of the enormous beast that was chasing them. Charlie didn't look back. He just swung the branch with all his strength, aiming for the bear's face. The blow landed with a sickening thud, and the bear howled in pain, staggering backward. It wasn't enough to stop the creature, but it gave Charlie the few precious seconds he needed. He scooped Sarah back up, her body limp in his arms, and bolted forward, pushing himself harder than he ever had in his life. The bear roared again, angrier now, but it didn't follow. It had been momentarily distracted. That was all he needed. Charlie pushed through the trees, his feet slipping on the wet, uneven ground. His breath was ragged, his chest heaving, but he couldn't stop. He wouldn't stop. Finally, through the trees, he saw a small clearing ahead. A break in the woods. The path was clearer here, no thick underbrush to slow him down, no more trees to get caught on. Almost there. His legs burned with exhaustion, and his lungs screamed for air, but he was so close to freedom. He could taste it. The smell of fresh air, the sound of safety, just beyond the trees. But then, out of nowhere, the bear charged again, faster this time. Charlie had no warning. The beast crashed into him, knocking him to the ground, the breath knocked out of his lungs. He landed hard, the air whooshing from his chest, and for a moment, he couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. The bear towered above him, its eyes wild and hungry. Its massive paws reached for him, its claws raking through the air. Charlie's heart pounded as he scrambled to regain his bearings, but his body felt sluggish, like it was trapped in slow motion. He reached for the branch again, but it had been knocked out of his hands when he fell. The bear was too close now. He could feel the heat of its breath on his face, the stench of its fur, the sharpness of its claws in the air. It was almost too much. But then, through the chaos, there was a sound. A voice. A shout. "Get off him!" It was a woman's voice, strong and commanding, and it pierced through the din of the forest like a knife. Charlie turned, his eyes blurry with exhaustion and fear, and saw a figure moving toward them. The figure was armed, holding something in her hand, something long and pointed. A spear. The woman lunged forward, driving the spear straight into the bear's side. The beast howled in pain, rearing back, its massive form swaying as it tried to retreat. "Run!" the woman shouted. "Get out of here, now!" Charlie didn't need to be told twice. With every ounce of strength he had left, he scrambled to his feet, clutching Sarah's limp form to his chest. He ran, faster than he thought possible, pushing himself toward the clearing, the woman's voice urging him on. The bear was distracted. The woman's spear had found its mark, but it wasn't enough to stop the creature completely. Charlie didn't dare look back. He couldn't afford to. And then, finally, they broke through the trees. The woman's voice called out one last time. "Go! Go!" Charlie's legs burned with exhaustion, his body aching with every step. Sarah's limp form felt heavier in his arms with each passing moment, but there was no time to stop. No time to rest. The woods were still a maze of towering trees and thick brush, and even though the bear was momentarily distracted, Charlie knew they weren't out of danger yet. He could still hear it, somewhere behind him, growling, moving through the forest with an eerie, predatory grace. But he wasn't looking back. He couldn't afford to. Ahead, the woman who had saved them was moving quickly, her pace unbroken as she led them towards safety. She was tall and wiry, with dark hair tied back in a practical knot, her face hard but determined. Her eyes flicked from side to side, constantly scanning their surroundings, her movements efficient and purposeful, as though she knew this forest like the back of her hand. Charlie's breath was coming in ragged gasps, his muscles screaming for rest, but he knew there was no option but to keep moving. He had to trust this woman. She had saved them from the bear, but there was still too much uncertainty in the air. Who was she? What did she want? Why had she been in the woods to begin with? "Keep up," the woman called over her shoulder, her voice low but firm. She didn't slow her pace. "We're not out of danger yet." Charlie nodded, though he wasn't sure if she could see him. He wasn't sure of anything right now, except that he had to survive. And Sarah. He couldn't let anything happen to her. His eyes flicked down to her pale face, her eyelids fluttering as if she were on the brink of slipping into unconsciousness. There was blood on her shirt, thin trails that had seeped from the gash on her leg, the one the man had inflicted when he dragged her through the woods. She had to be in pain, but she wasn't crying. She wasn't moving at all. "Sarah?" Charlie whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "Sarah, can you hear me?" She didn't respond, her head lolling limply against his shoulder. Charlie's heart clenched. He could feel the panic rising in his chest, the fear of losing her, of not being able to help her, of not being able to get her to safety. Please don't let her die. The woman, sensing his desperation, glanced back. She's not dead, she said, her tone sharp. But she needs help. We need to get to the cabin. A cabin? Charlie's voice cracked, barely audible above the sound of his own breath. Where? Where are we going? Just keep moving, the woman said, her voice softer now, though it still carried a note of urgency. I'll explain when we're safe. The trees around them began to thin, the dense underbrush easing into a more manageable path. The ground grew steadier beneath Charlie's feet, less treacherous. As they moved forward, the noises of the forest seemed to quiet down, no more growls from the bear, no more snapping branches or rustling leaves. For a brief moment, it almost felt like they were alone in the wilderness. But Charlie knew better than to let his guard down. They rounded a bend, and then Charlie saw it. Just ahead, partially obscured by trees and brush, was a small wooden cabin. It was tucked away in a clearing, hidden from the rest of the world as though it had been carved out of the very forest itself. It looked old, but sturdy, weathered by time, but still intact. There was a smoke trail rising from the chimney, suggesting that someone had been there recently. Without slowing down, the woman pushed open the cabin door, stepping inside without a word. Charlie followed her, his heart pounding in his chest as he carefully lowered Sarah onto a rough-hewn table near the center of the room. The cabin was dim, lit only by the faint glow of a few scattered candles, and the air inside was thick with the smell of burning wood and earth. The woman immediately went to a corner of the cabin where a small, well-organized medical kit was stored. Her hands moved quickly, efficiently as she pulled out gauze, antiseptic, and a pair of scissors. "Take care of her," Charlie whispered, still shaking with the weight of what had just happened. His voice was hoarse, the adrenaline from the chase beginning to wear off, leaving him with an overwhelming sense of exhaustion. "Please." The woman didn't respond at first. She was already focused on Sarah, carefully assessing the girl's injuries with quick, practiced hands. The tension in the air was thick, and Charlie could feel the pressure in his chest mounting as the minutes ticked by. He paced in the small cabin, trying to steady his thoughts, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. But it was like trying to piece together a broken puzzle. Nothing fit. Nothing made sense. "Is she going to be okay?" Charlie asked, his voice sharp with concern. He stopped pacing and moved closer to the table, standing over Sarah's prone form. His heart felt like it was being squeezed in his chest. He couldn't lose her. The woman didn't look up as she worked, but her voice was steady. "She'll be fine," she said. "She's just in shock. She needs rest and time. The leg wound isn't deep, but it needs to be cleaned properly." Charlie nodded, but the knot in his stomach didn't loosen. He could still feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him, too many unanswered questions. Where people have gone missing. There are forces in these woods, forces that want to remain hidden. Charlie stood there, frozen, his heart pounding in his chest as the weight of Rachel's words sunk in. The forest isn't just dangerous. It's something more. And suddenly, the world around him seemed to shift. The path ahead was no longer clear. There were no easy answers. They were no longer just running from a bear or a madman. There were forces in this forest that were much more terrifying. Charlie's mind raced. Rachel's words echoed in his ears, and his pulse quickened. A dark force lurking in the woods? The idea was almost too terrifying to entertain, but Rachel had seen something real, and now, Charlie was caught in its wake. He had already been through so much, but the path ahead seemed infinitely darker than he could have imagined. He glanced at Sarah, still unconscious on the table, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. The gauze was wrapped tightly around her leg, but there was a pallor to her face that worried him. She was breathing, but only just. She needed medical help, but Rachel hadn't offered him much hope. And the uncertainty in her voice only deepened his fear. Charlie could feel the walls of the cabin pressing in on him. The shadows cast by the flickering candles seemed to stretch unnaturally, like something watching, something just beyond the edges of the light. The air felt thick and suffocating, heavy with unspoken truths. He turned his gaze back to Rachel, his mind reeling with questions. Why are you telling me this?" he asked, his voice rough and trembling, betraying the confusion that twisted in his gut. "What does it all mean? What's happening out there in the woods?" Rachel's eyes softened, just for a moment, before her face hardened again. She took a slow breath, as if bracing herself for what she was about to say. Her fingers absently traced the edge of the table, her gaze unfocused as she thought through her words carefully. "There are things in this forest that were never meant to be uncovered," she said, her voice steady, but the gravity of her words weighed heavily in the air. "Things that were buried long ago by people who thought they could control them. But you can't control something that's older than time itself. It's been here for generations, waiting for the right moment to resurface." Charlie's heart skipped a beat. The cold dread that had been creeping at the edges of his mind now gripped him fully. His instincts told him to run, to get out of the woods and away from this woman, from whatever she was alluding to. But the thought of leaving Sarah behind, of abandoning her in a place like this, made the idea of running impossible. "I don't understand," Charlie muttered, shaking his head, his hands trembling. "What kind of things? Are you saying the man who grabbed Sarah, he wasn't just a psychopath? He was part of something bigger?" Rachel nodded slowly, her gaze hardening with something close to regret, or maybe it was a warning. "Yes," she said, her voice laced with a quiet, undeniable truth. "That man was a part of something much worse. And he's not the only one. There are more of them out there. They belong to a group, a cult of sorts, people who've been living in these woods, hidden from the rest of the world. People who are willing to do anything to get what they want. And what they want is much more dangerous than you can imagine." Charlie felt the ground beneath his feet shift. The reality of the situation was dawning on him in sharp, cruel waves. It wasn't just a random encounter. It wasn't just a man dragging Sarah through the forest. It was part of something far more insidious. Something that had been lurking under the surface for years. Why? Why would they want Sarah? Charlie's voice cracked, the knot in his stomach tightening with each word. "She's just a little girl. She's innocent. What could they possibly want with her?" Rachel's expression darkened, and she moved to a nearby shelf, pulling out a small, weathered journal. The cover was cracked, the pages yellowed with age, but she handled it with reverence, as though it were something sacred. "The thing about this forest," Rachel began, her voice low, "is that it's not just a wilderness. It's a place of power, old power. People have been drawn to it for centuries, trying to harness it, trying to control it. But it's never worked. It's always pushed back, taken back what they tried to steal." Charlie felt a chill creep down his spine. What kind of power? Rachel opened the journal, her fingers skimming over the pages. She stopped at a particular entry, one that seemed to resonate with her, and she began to read aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. "In the heart of the woods lies the place where the veil between worlds is thinnest. There, the spirits of the forest stir, their power untapped. To wield it, one must offer a blood price, a child's blood. Only then can the veil be torn open, and the power within be freed." Charlie's breath caught in his throat. His mind struggled to process the words, the meaning behind them. Blood price. Spirits. A veil between worlds. It all sounded like a nightmare, a fantasy. But the fear in Rachel's eyes told him that this was no myth. "Are you saying that they," Charlie's voice faltered, "they wanted to use Sarah as some kind of sacrifice?" Rachel nodded solemnly, closing the journal with a quiet snap. Her eyes met his, and for the first time, Charlie saw something that wasn't just resolve or anger. There was fear in her gaze, a deep, abiding terror. They didn't just want her. They needed her, Rachel explained. Her voice trembling slightly now, a crack of vulnerability breaking through her earlier strength. She's the key. Her blood is what they need to open the veil. Once they have that, they can summon what's been waiting, something far worse than any bear or wolf you've seen. Charlie's head spun, the weight of her words pressing down on him with an overwhelming force. He wanted to dismiss it, to believe it was some kind of delusion, but he couldn't. Not after what he had witnessed. Not after everything that had happened. The terror that had been following them, pounding through the woods, hidden in the shadows, was real. He looked down at Sarah, her fragile form still lying motionless on the table. She had been a target, a pawn in a twisted game, caught in the web of something far beyond her control. The thought that someone had planned to use her in such a horrific way made his blood run cold. What happens if they succeed? Charlie whispered, the question hanging in the air, heavy and foreboding. Rachel's gaze flicked toward the door, as though she were listening for something just beyond it. She didn't answer immediately. She seemed to be weighing something, as though deciding how much to reveal. If they succeed, she said at last, her voice grim, the balance of the world will shift. The veil between the living and the dead will be torn open, and the spirits of the forest will be unleashed. The world won't be the same. Not for anyone. Charlie's head was spinning. His vision blurred, his thoughts racing faster than he could process. The pieces weren't fitting together. He couldn't make sense of any of it. How can we stop them? He asked, desperation creeping into his voice. How can we stop them from getting to Sarah? Rachel met his gaze, her expression hardening once again. We need to destroy the source of their power. The thing they've been trying to awaken. If we don't, Sarah won't just be their sacrifice. She'll be the one who sets it free. Charlie took a shaky breath. His hands were clenched into fists, his mind whirling with the enormity of what he was being asked to do. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about stopping something bigger, something that could destroy everything. He glanced at Sarah once again, his heart aching for her. She didn't deserve any of this. No one did. Where do we go? Charlie asked. What do we do? Rachel stood up, moving to a cabinet near the back of the cabin, pulling out a map. She unrolled it on the table, her finger tracing a line across the paper. This is where they're hiding, she said, pointing to a remote section of the woods, deep in the heart of the forest. It's the old ruins. That's where the power lies. We need to get there before they do. We need to stop whatever ritual they're planning before it's too late. Charlie nodded, determination filling him. He didn't care what it took. He didn't care how dangerous it was. He was going to save Sarah. And he was going to stop this madness, whatever it took. The night was colder now, the air thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. The cabin was silent, save for the soft crackle of the fire in the hearth. Charlie couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, his mind was flooded with images of Sarah, her pale face, the blood on her leg, the strange power in Rachel's words. He sat on a wooden stool by the fire, his eyes fixed on the flames. His mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, each one darker and more terrifying than the last. He had always thought of forests as places of beauty and peace. But tonight, the woods felt like a prison, a labyrinth of shadows and danger, and the very heart of it all seemed to lie within the ruins Rachel had mentioned. Sarah stirred on the table, her breath shallow, but she hadn't woken. The bandages on her leg were clean, but she needed rest. She needed time to heal, but there was no time to spare. They had to move. The ritual was already in motion, and they were running out of time. Charlie stood up, pacing back and forth across the cabin. His muscles ached from the exertion of the past hours, but there was no room for weakness. He had to keep moving. He had to save Sarah. Rachel, he said suddenly, turning to face her. She was sitting at the table, quietly watching him. Her face was calm, but there was an underlying tension in her eyes. Are you sure we can stop them? Is there really a way to destroy whatever power they're trying to unleash? Rachel didn't answer right away. She was silent for a long moment, her gaze distant as she thought through his question. Finally, she nodded, her expression hardening. There's a way, she said, her voice firm, but it won't be easy. The power they're trying to awaken is ancient. It's not something that can be destroyed with a simple weapon or a spell. The only way to stop it is to destroy the source, the heart of it all. The ruins are where it all began. If we destroy that, the power will fade. But getting there, she trailed off, her voice dropping lower. It won't be easy. They won't let us get close. Charlie swallowed hard. How do we get to the ruins? Rachel stood up, moving toward the window. She parted the heavy curtains, peering out into the darkness. Her face was partially illuminated by the dim light of the fire, but her expression was unreadable. Into the forest, the closer they came to the heart of the darkness. The ruins are in the heart of the forest, she said softly, her voice distant, as though she were speaking to herself. It's a place no one dares to go. There's something about that place, it feels wrong. It's where the veil is the thinnest, where the spirits are strongest. That's why they've chosen it. They can't awaken what they want without it. Then how do we stop them? Charlie repeated, his voice more insistent now. What do we do once we get there? Rachel finally turned from the window, her eyes meeting his. There was a glint of something, determination, perhaps, or something darker. We destroy the source, she said again. The heart of the power. The old altar. If we destroy it, the ritual will fail. The power will fade. And how do we destroy it? Charlie asked, his voice shaking now, the weight of their task pressing down on him. Rachel didn't answer immediately. She looked down at her hands, her fingers curling into fists as if preparing herself for something she wasn't ready to face. It's not easy, she said at last. The altar is protected, by the spirits, by the power itself. It's not just a matter of striking it down. We have to sever the connection between the altar and the world. And that means we have to deal with the ones who guard it. Charlie's heart skipped a beat. Guardians? Rachel nodded grimly. There are always guardians. People who protect the power, who believe in it, who worship it. And they'll do anything to stop us from destroying it. Charlie's mind spun. The stakes had just grown infinitely higher. Not only did they have to stop a ritual that threatened to tear apart the very fabric of reality, but they also had to face the people who were willing to die to protect it. How many? Charlie asked, his throat dry. Rachel's eyes flicked away from him, her gaze settling on the table, where Sarah lay motionless. I don't know, she said quietly. It could be a few. It could be many. But they'll be prepared. They've been waiting for this moment for a long time. Charlie's stomach tightened. Then we need to move. We don't have time to waste. Rachel nodded. Get Sarah ready. We leave as soon as she's able to travel. Charlie moved quickly to Sarah's side. He gently lifted her, checking to make sure her leg was properly supported. She stirred, her eyelids fluttering, but she didn't wake. The fever was still there, but it seemed to be subsiding, at least for now. He hoped she would be strong enough to move. He couldn't leave her behind. The fire crackled as the night stretched on, the weight of their situation pressing down on them both. Charlie could feel the tension in the air, something had shifted in the woods. The air was thick, charged with a sense of foreboding. It felt as though the very trees were watching them, waiting. The further they ventured. Rachel gathered a few supplies, her knives, the journal, a small pouch of herbs, and a rope. She moved quickly, but there was an eerie stillness about her, a calm that unsettled Charlie. She had lived in these woods for so long. She knew something about them that he didn't. And it terrified him. "Are you ready?" Rachel asked, breaking the silence. Charlie took a deep breath, steadying himself. "I'm ready. Let's go." The journey through the woods was grueling. Every step felt heavier than the last, the forest closing in around them, the darkness creeping ever closer. The trees loomed overhead, their branches twisting and reaching like skeletal fingers, blocking out the moonlight. Charlie's heart raced as he carried Sarah, his muscles aching with the strain. But he didn't stop. There was no time to stop. Rachel led the way, her pace unbroken, her eyes constantly scanning the trees, her senses alert to every sound. She moved with the confidence of someone who had walked these paths countless times. But even she seemed uneasy. The further they went, the darker the forest grew, as though they were moving into another world entirely. Charlie couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every rustling branch, every distant snap of a twig set his nerves on edge. And yet, Rachel kept moving forward, her determination unwavering. They walked in silence for what felt like hours, the only sound the crunch of their footsteps on the forest floor. Charlie's mind kept returning to the ruins, to the altar. What would they find when they got there? What kind of power were they up against? And most importantly, could they stop it in time? Finally, Rachel paused, holding up a hand to signal for them to stop. Charlie froze, his heart pounding in his chest. She turned to him, her face shadowed by the darkness. "We're close," she said quietly. "The ruins are just ahead. Stay close. Don't make a sound." Charlie nodded, his grip tightening on Sarah. His breath was shallow, his senses heightened. The air felt thick with tension, and his instincts screamed at him to run, to turn back. But he couldn't. Not now. Not when they were so close. They moved forward, each step bringing them closer to the heart of the woods. The path grew narrower, the trees closing in around them. The forest felt alive, every rustle, every creak of the branches seemed to carry an ominous weight. Charlie's mind raced with fear, but he pushed it aside. He had no choice. He had to keep going. Finally, they reached a clearing. In the center stood the ruins. It was an ancient structure, half overgrown with ivy and moss. The stones were weathered, cracked with age, but there was an unmistakable energy around it, something dark, something ancient. The air felt charged with a strange power, and Charlie could feel it pulsing in his chest, heavy and oppressive. The altar was in the center, a large stone slab surrounded by faded carvings and symbols, some of which Charlie didn't recognize. It was here, in this place, that the ritual would take place. And it was here, in this very spot, that they had to stop it. The clearing was eerily silent, the air thick with an oppressive stillness that made Charlie's chest tighten with fear. He could feel the weight of something ancient, something dark, pressing down on him from all sides. The ruins, crumbling yet imposing, stood in the center of the forest, the stone altar like a beacon of danger. The power here was palpable, almost suffocating, and Charlie's instincts screamed at him to turn back, to leave the forest before it consumed him. But there was no turning back. Rachel stepped forward, her eyes scanning the shadows. She had gone quiet, her body tense, every movement purposeful. Charlie could see the determination in her eyes, but there was something else too, something darker, something that made him feel as though they were stepping into a trap. Sarah lay motionless in his arms, her head lolling against his chest. The fever had not yet fully broken, and her shallow breaths made his heart ache with fear. She had suffered so much already, and now they were in the heart of it all. He had to save her. He had to stop whatever ritual was being performed here before it was too late. Rachel turned to him, her expression solemn. "This is it," she whispered, her voice low and almost reverent. "The altar is where it all happens. The ritual, whatever they were planning, ends here." We have to destroy it. Charlie nodded, though his throat was dry and his palms were slick with sweat. He wasn't sure how they could destroy something so old, so powerful, but he didn't have a choice. They had to stop it. Suddenly, a sound broke the silence, a rustling from the trees at the edge of the clearing. Rachel's body stiffened, her eyes narrowing. She held up a hand, signaling for Charlie to stay still. From the shadows, figures began to emerge. At first, they were just silhouettes, dark shapes moving among the trees. But then they came into the light, and Charlie's blood turned to ice in his veins. The Guardians. They were dressed in tattered, hooded cloaks, their faces hidden in shadow. Some of them were tall, others short, but all of them carried an air of menace, an unsettling presence that made the hair on the back of Charlie's neck stand up. They moved with a fluid, almost predatory grace, their eyes fixed on him and Rachel, their expressions unreadable. One of them stepped forward, a tall figure with a deep, gravelly voice that sent a shiver through Charlie's spine. "You should not have come," the figure said, his voice low, almost a growl. "This is where it ends for you." Charlie clenched his jaw, his hands tightening around Sarah as if to shield her from the impending danger. He knew they couldn't let the Guardians stop them. They had come too far, faced too many dangers. They had to finish this. They had to destroy the altar. Rachel didn't flinch. She stood tall, her eyes unwavering as she faced the leader of the Guardians. "We're here to stop the ritual," she said, her voice steady but laced with urgency. "The veil must not be torn open. We can't let you unleash what's trapped inside." The Guardian leader chuckled, a low, almost mocking sound. "You think you can stop it? You think you can stop what has been set in motion for centuries? The veil is already weakening. You're too late." Charlie's heart hammered in his chest as he looked around, realizing the extent of their predicament. They were surrounded, at least 10, maybe more, Guardians closing in from all sides. They couldn't fight them all. They had to act fast. Without warning, Rachel moved, her hand darting to her belt, pulling out a small knife. She lunged toward the leader, her movement swift and precise. But the Guardians reacted instantly, moving like shadows, closing in on her. She slashed at the air, but before she could land a blow, two of the Guardians grabbed her arms, forcing her to the ground. "No!" Charlie shouted, his pulse racing. He had to do something. He couldn't let them capture her. The Guardians turned their attention to him now, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. One of them stepped toward him, a wicked grin on his face. "You can't save her," he sneered. "She's already lost." Charlie's mind raced, his heart pounding in his chest. He had no weapons, no plan, nothing but the determination to stop them. He couldn't fight them all, but maybe there was another way. Maybe there was something he could do to give Rachel a chance to finish what they had started. He looked down at Sarah, her small, pale form in his arms. He had to protect her. He had to protect them both. In a flash of clarity, Charlie made his decision. He could see it now, the way the Guardians were focused on Rachel and him, how they were leaving the altar vulnerable, just for a moment. He sprinted toward the stone altar, Sarah still clutched in his arms. The Guardians didn't notice him immediately, their attention fixated on Rachel, who was struggling against the two who held her down. Charlie reached the altar, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the power in the air now, the energy coursing through the stones, the air buzzing with an almost magnetic force. The altar pulsed with a strange, unnatural glow, and he knew that if they didn't destroy it, everything would be lost. Without thinking, he set Sarah down gently on the stone. He could hear her soft, ragged breathing, but he had no time to waste. He had to act quickly. Rachel's voice pierced the air. "Charlie." "No." But he couldn't stop. He had to finish this. He reached into his pocket, pulling out the small pouch of herbs that Rachel had given him earlier. He didn't know exactly what it was meant to do, but he had to trust her. She had said it was a key ingredient in breaking the connection to the veil. He poured the herbs over the altar, the dried leaves falling onto the stone like dust. For a moment, nothing happened. But then, the ground trembled beneath his feet, and a low rumble echoed through the clearing. The air around them began to hum, and Charlie felt the power intensify, growing stronger with every passing second. The guardians seemed to sense it too. They backed away, their eyes widening in fear, but they didn't retreat. Instead, they drew closer, preparing for a fight. But just as Charlie braced himself for what was to come, a loud, otherworldly scream filled the air, a sound so loud and bone-chilling that it made his entire body tremble. It came from the forest itself, as though the woods were alive, the trees themselves screaming in pain. Charlie's heart froze as the ground beneath him cracked open, and something began to rise from the altar. A dark, swirling mist, black as night, coiled up from the stone, writhing and twisting as it expanded. The mist seemed to pulse with an almost malevolent energy, and Charlie could feel the weight of it, the terrible power that it held. He looked at Rachel, who was struggling against the guardian's grip, her eyes wide with terror. "Charlie! The ritual's not over," she screamed. "You have to destroy the altar, now." But it was too late. The mist had risen fully, and in its wake, the world seemed to distort, the very air crackling with energy. The guardians backed away, fear evident in their eyes, but it was clear that they had done what they set out to do. They had unleashed whatever force had been trapped for so long. The mist spread, consuming everything in its path, until Charlie could no longer see the altar, no longer see the guardians, no longer see anything at all. And then, with a final, deafening roar, the mist exploded, sending a shockwave through the clearing. Everything went black.